Hi, all.
Hi, guys.
How's it going?
Great.
Awesome.
And also, your week was good.
Week is going well, thank you. Especially after seeing Hot Chocolate add federation support. Yeah, it was really great. Yeah, really awesome work. Yeah.
Thanks for merging.
Yeah, no, it's really exciting to see. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we're still working on the tracing support, but
yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah, it's not as quite, it's always a little bit more work to get that in. So that's why a lot of people don't quite support it yet, but that's awesome for sure.
Yeah. I mean, you have, at the moment, you have to dig at the proto files that are, I think they are not in the specification. So the specification section is missing.
Yeah. Yeah, if you run into, yeah, we'll talk more offline. Feel free to ping me anytime if you have any questions about that, because there's a lot of stuff we could be doing better to help people with it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Thanks.
How are you doing, Benji?
Yeah, not bad. Thanks. Yourself?
Good. Good. Thank you. Has it been a month already? This is,
I know, right?
Time is just flying by. Wow.
And thanks again for linking those comments into the deprecated inputs PR.
Hi.
There we go. Somehow managed to find myself in like another room. Like I joined this and there's nobody here. I was like, that doesn't seem right. Check the number and it was correct.
Wow, that's bizarre.
Let me retry. I retried and yeah, here's everybody. So way to go, Zoom. Let me pull together my agenda real quick. How's everyone doing? Happy Thursday. Or yep, Thursday, February.
Thursday. Doing well.
My brain's fried these days. All right. Let's see if we've got any last minute pull requests. Seems not. Fantastic. All right, let's get going then. Welcome everybody. Yeah. Happy February, second working group meeting of the year. Looking at our agenda real quick, of course, by us all being here, we agree to the spec membership agreement, participation guidelines, contribution guide and code of conduct. Links all there, right there in the agenda, if you ever want to peruse them. Let's do a quick round of intros. We will use the order as it appears in the agenda markdown file. That's me right on the top, so I'll go first. Hello, everyone. My name is Lee.
And hi, I'm Stephen. I work with Netflix.
My name is Michael, and I work for Chili Cream, and we're working mainly on the .NET platform.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm from the Guild.
Hey, I'm Benji from GraphQL.
Rob from First Dibs, working on the Ferret stream.
Hi, I'm Roman. I'm from Seattle, Microsoft.
Hi, I'm Sahaj. I'm from the Guild.
Hey, I'm Alex. I'm at Yelp.
Was one of those silences for me. I guess I'm on my phone, so I didn't see this list in the same order. Hey, I'm Eloy from Microsoft, Amsterdam. And we are starting a GraphQL at Microsoft Meetup, and there's already a lot of participants. So this will be bringing this news to every. We now have the Meetup every first Monday after the first Thursday of the month. So that is fun scheduling stuff.
There you go. That's awesome.
Did we get Oleg?
I don't know if I saw Oleg in the.
Not on the participant
here
list
yet.
right now.
Word.
No.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'm at Meta now, I guess. I'm in New York.
I'm Rob. I'm from Shopify in Toronto.
Morris from IBM.
Hi, all. Hugh from Apollo.
Hey everyone, Mark from Netflix.
Everyone, Robert from AWS.
Hey, I'm Sasha. I'm from Twitter.
Hi, I'm Ivan, and I'm from Apollo.
You're muted, Yakov.
Sorry about that. I definitely was. I'm Yakov, and I individual contributor working on schema stitching.
Fantastic. Did we miss anybody? All right. Well aligned to the list on the Markdown file. So fantastic. Great to see all your beautiful faces again. We have a pretty tight agenda today. So hopefully that means two things. One is that we can go a little bit deep into some of these. And two is that we will end on time or earlier. I did get my notes file in the Markdown before the start of the hour. Please take a look at the notes file if, especially as folks start talking. It's always super helpful. Folks can jump in there and help type. I see a handful of cursors already in there, so that's fantastic. Let's take a quick look at what we got on our plate. We, I think, have a handful of open action items. Hopefully we can use a couple of minutes to dig through those. And then the meat of the meeting, we've got three things to talk about. One is deprecation of inputs. Another update on defer and stream. Some really interesting topics to dig into there, as well as recursive references in fragments. Anything else that we should talk about today? It's not yet on the agenda. All right. Let's take a quick look at actions. I'm going to take a look at anything that's ready for review. We have one thing marked ready for review: client-controlled nullability. Add to the list of unanswered questions, null versus error boundary. Alex, maybe you can give us a quick update on what's happened since this time, or since the last meeting. I know you were sort of in input mode, trying to make sure you understood all your open questions.
Yeah, is it cool if I share my screen real quick?
Yeah, go nuts.
Okay. So we had access to discussions now. So I opened up a bunch of these discussion threads. There's three. There's one for the list syntax, another for null propagation, and another for error handling. I've separated out error handling and null propagation since I could see a world where maybe those are two different pieces of syntax or they're handled separately, something like that. I've added polls to the top of these just to get where sentiment is. Totally non-binding, just, see where we're at. There's different threads for each option. Feel free to, throw yourself behind whichever option you like the best. I'm hoping that gets discussion moving along. We can land on something. Yeah, I don't know. If we have time later, maybe we can talk more about what's going on here. But that's what's up now. And if there's anything else I can do to make discussion easier and more pleasant, I tried to do what I could to make it like a lower barrier to entry before you kind of had to read the entire thread to figure out what was going on. So hopefully now you don't have to do that anymore.
This is awesome. Thanks for leading some experimental process through reviewing our RFCs. This one's definitely got some complicated pieces, so I like this model. And that's a good idea. If we have got time at the end of the meeting, then maybe we can take a minute to dig through those as a group, at least give everybody context, and then we can break and let people follow up within those threads. Sure. Yeah, thanks for that quick update though. Much appreciated. I went ahead and closed that one that was marked ready to review. Just taking a quick look at the rest of our open items. I'm taking a look at our projects list. We still have a handful of actions that are many months old. So might have to come take a look at these later to figure out which ones are super old. There was one open last month about asking folks to take a look at non-nullable fields discussion for defer and stream. Rob, I know we're going to get time to dig into this. Do you feel like you got meaningful attention that you wanted in the last month for feedback?
Yeah, I got a comment from Josevona, but I kind of have an idea of how I want to handle this. So I guess we'll see if when I go over it, if everyone else agrees or any other alternatives.
I'll go ahead and close this one then, since you got some, and if we want to do follow-ups, we'll just open new ones. But that's great. And one of these was just opened recently, so that's definitely not going to be ready for review yet. Okay, I think that's probably all the ones we have open for review. Anyone see any of those open actions? If you all are looking at the same thing I am, anything that seems like it should be ready to close or there's updates on?
Yeah, I have one actually. The input, the one of RFC, one of the community members has actually started work on the GraphQL JS implementation of this. I've not had time to review it fully. I've had a glance over it. It looks fine. One of itself is quite a simple change to the GraphQL spec. So fortunately, the changes in GraphQL JS itself is not particularly complicated. But if anyone else wanted to take a look at those changes, that would be great. I think it's actually on a fork right now rather than as a pull request to GraphQL JS. I can encourage it to be moved to GraphQL JS if that makes sense.
Is it just the input object or also the arguments?
It's the input object and the output objects, but not the arguments.
Oh, it's the output object. Okay. Great. I will have a look.
Fantastic.
Nice.
And thank you to Eric for doing that.
I want. Yeah, go ahead.
Go on. The other thing was the security policy, I think is one of the open issues somewhere, maybe. But I have opened an RFC. So if any TSC members can have a look at that, and anyone else as well, of course. We need a couple of approvals on it. I think Matt's already approved it. But yeah, it's what we discussed last month, just now formally filed. I've also gone ahead and opened a pull request on the spec as well with a much smaller security policy file that effectively links to the TSC one. So yeah, getting both of those merged at some point soon would be good.
Nice. Yeah, I just shared a link to that. And feel free to take a look. Hopefully, I think this is all pretty non-controversial. The one thought that I had was we should make it really super obvious what to do if you want to disclose a security issue. And not in love with the idea that just like go find a TSC member and message them. Not a super scalable approach, but looks like Brian's going to help us set up an email thread. Or I mean an email account. security@graphql.org was his recommendation. Like it. But yeah, thank you for getting that put in place. The other ones that I see that might be interesting to just get a gut check on are there's two that are both marked everyone review. One is everyone reviewing spec text changes for argument uniqueness RFC. I think that was from like summer of last year, but we were at a backlog for opening up action items. And here I'll paste links to these as I'm looking at them. And the other one is reviewing schema coordinates. There's a pull request that is still open. Just want to drop those links. So if you get a chance today, please take a look at those. Hopefully we can come back to this and close these out next time or sometime between now and the next time. So I think those are just seeking feedback so that they get unblocked. All right. I think that's all of our action items. Let's keep going. Stephen, I'm going to hand it to you to talk about deprecation of inputs.
All right, thank you, Lee. So deprecation of inputs. This is a PR RFC that it's at stage 2 currently. And so a goal today is to get it officially to stage 3, or if not, identify action items on that. And so so quick context on this for those not familiar. We're talking about the deprecated directive that previously could not be applied to either arguments on fields or input objects. And so this changes to make it do that. It's been discussed several times over the last few years. It had been discussed in 2020, and there was one little point of debate about if you have an argument that is required, meaning it's not null and there's no default, should it be possible to mark that as deprecated? And we were thinking, well, in any case, it's not a good idea to mark it as deprecated, but Shopify had a potential use case that maybe you could plausibly do that. Since then, it's been implemented in GraphQL JS and also GraphQL Java, and it was implemented with a validation that just made it so that it was impossible to deprecate something that's required, and there hasn't been any pushback from that. And so the latest revision of this goes ahead and specifies that using the stronger wording of shall or must, that you can't deprecate something if it's required. So and then the other pending thing was just having it it's been fully implemented with the validation and everything. So any discussion, thoughts on that? Cool. Stage 3.
I think the only thing that would block this getting to stage 3 is editorial review from me, and this is pretty short. So I'm going to preemptively put it on stage 3 as a forcing function to make sure that I do that. But considering that it's short and this has been implemented for a while, unless anybody has objections, we're going to assume consensus here that this is the right thing to do.
Exciting. All right, thanks, y'all.
Very good. I think that's our first accepted RFC of 2021. Nice work, Stephen, on getting this across the finish line. And of course, to Yvonne for making sure a lot of this stuff got implemented.
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne.
Well, that was a fast action item. Amazing. All right, Rob, I'll hand it to you to give us an update on what's going on in the world of defer and stream.
Yeah, so I had 2 issues that I wanted to talk through. The first one is about enforcing delivery order of payloads. It's something that we've talked about a few times in a few different meetings. I'm going to share my screen so we have the issues open. Yeah, so last time we talked about this, I think there was general agreement that we should be enforcing delivery order, and it should roughly follow a tree hierarchical approach. So I have the specifics laid out now. Basically, I've updated the spec that whenever the execution algorithm comes across a defer stream directive and it starts executing the fields from that directive, it keeps a reference to a data structure that has what would be in JavaScript a promise of the whole execution, and that gets passed down to the execute selection set through collect fields, through execute fields, complete value, through all those functions. And when another defer stream is encountered, that reference, the reference to that data structure is passed through. And as part of that execution, we're specifying that if this parent data structure is passed in, it has to wait for that one to be finished before it itself can be completed. So in JavaScript, it just likes having another .then if that thing exists to make sure you wait for it. And that has the effect of not ever getting a payload from a defer that was inside of another defer before that parent one was resolved. Similarly, as when you're doing a stream, each field has a reference to the previous one so that you don't get a field out of order. You don't get a higher numbered index field before a lower numbered one. And all the combinations of stream inside of defer and defer inside of stream should be accounted for with this. I have like a more detailed explanation of this, and I have a bunch of examples. I think notably the only one that might be confusing is this case. Which one is it? Hold on. It's the case where you have a fragment spread directly inside of another fragment spread, and they're considered siblings because of collect fields works recursively. So those would not be held up by each other. Yeah, did that all make sense?
I think so. Just to repeat what you just said to make sure I understood it. If you mark a fragment spread as deferred, and that has another fragment spread within that is deferred, those are just essentially merged. That ends up being like one total set of things that are deferred at the same level. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. This seems right. It feels complicated when you work through all of the ramifications, but the actual details here are not actually that complicated, right? You're saying if something gets deferred, it's going to come after the path before it. And if something is streamed, then they'll come in the appropriate order. And the combination of those two constraints yields all this other behavior.
Yeah, to me, conceptually, it makes sense. And I think it solves that original approach of never having a reference to a field that doesn't exist. It's a little bit more conservative than that. So like maybe if there are other optimizations where we only want that behavior, but not the entire tree preserving, that could be worked out in the future. But but I think this is like a conservative way to move forward. It's just kind of hard to describe it succinctly because there's a lot of moving parts, and this logic has to pass through the 4 different functions that are in the spec text.
Do we want to preserve like this the examples that you have here? I mean, not all of this will go in the spec text, but it's still valuable input side information.
Yeah, I feel like this this is going to be actually the hardest part of this whole process is the documentation after the fact, right? Like, luckily, Rob, you've been doing a great job and having a super high quality of documenting decisions along the way. So hopefully it'll be fairly straightforward, but I can imagine building like an entire, chapter of pages on the GraphQL.org website explaining these concepts and the edge and corner cases of how they get used. Maybe even just straight up linking to these decision records as long as they hold firm with the final form of this.
Yeah, definitely. I'll read. I'll definitely like keep reading through the spec and see where it makes sense to add more examples versus we do have these, and I'm happy to transfer this repo to the GraphQL org at any point if that makes sense, or move these issues somewhere. Whatever is easiest for everyone.
Actually, that's probably a good idea if you since I know you've got other collaborators working on this with you. If you want to put this in the GraphQL GitHub org, I'll just give you admin rights over that repo.
Okay.
That way it'll be easy for people to find.
I
Sorry,
think
go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
Rob, I think I missed a little bit on so I see your 4 examples. The example that you were saying that can be a little bit confusing, was that basically you on example C? I don't know if you explicitly do this. Is this if you have ... top fragment, and then underneath top fragment, if you have a spread immediately like above home world? Is that what you were just describing as being like?
Yeah,
oh,
that's what I meant.
Actually, okay.
I thought
yeah,
I had an example
I just wanted
here,
to.
but
Yep. Yeah, that would definitely be a good thing to add in documentation. But yep, that makes sense to me.
yeah, I think this example B was what I was referring to. So nested fragment is on person and under top fragment. So
okay, yeah, I missed that one. Cool.
these
Thank
two
you.
would be considered siblings and not parent child. All right. I mean, I guess if there's no objection, then
yeah, I was gonna say this is at this point, this is probably beyond just like a approve or reject just because it's detailed, right? So I think people can read this and if there's extra feedback, provide it. But maybe what's helpful, Rob, is like, what's your confidence with this? Do you see, are there trade-offs at play? Like what should we be concerned about? I trust that you've thought about this quite a lot, and this is probably the right path for us. But is this like, this is obviously the right thing to do, or are there trade-offs we should be considering?
I feel like this is the most conservative approach. So I think that it's possible that there are scenarios where we could be trading some performance for making it easier for clients to digest payloads. And I feel like I'm happy with this because I think that if those, because handling any of those other scenarios would be more complex than what this is. So I feel like if that's needed, it could be looked at later. Whereas this just.
Yeah. Okay. I think that aligns super well with the philosophy we've had going into this proposal all along, which is you don't defer something because you want to get it earlier, which would be the sort of side angle, right? It's like, if you could develop that deferred fragment earlier and deliver it, then why not? Some servers might even decide to not even begin preparing those fields until the previous fragment has been completed and delivered, just to optimize time to delivery for that first bit. So I like, this feels really good to me. Like the constraints here are very, very easy to describe, and it, you know, it creates a lot of behavior that seems quite reasonable and intuitive. So this is great. Thanks for doing the real detailed work of explaining exactly how it plays out.
All right, cool. So the next one is for non-nullable fields that are in defer and stream payloads. So the spec says that if you encounter a non-nullable field that does return null, that null should bubble up to the first nullable field. The problem is, what happens if that first nullable field is already sent in a previous payload and the non-nullable field is deferred? So my thoughts on it were that if a deferred fragment bubbles all the way up to null, are we actually breaking any of these guarantees about nullable fields that GraphQL makes? Because we're not specifically saying that a field is null, we're saying that this fragment isn't here anymore. So I feel like that's kind of like a fragment that was skipped or not included. It's more that the whole thing errored out and you didn't receive it. Whereas stream is a little bit more complicated, because for stream, we're actually returning the fields inside the list. And if those are non-nullable, then we have to say it's null. So I was thinking just a validation rule, prevent stream on non-nullable lists. That will just avoid the problem entirely. And maybe we could address it later with client control nullability. But defer, I think that it's might be okay to just bubble up a null to the data field on the fragment. And then clients should treat that as, we just don't have this fragment and it's not ever coming.
Yeah, it's essentially we have broken up the request, so we cannot do the null propagation of the whole result. Otherwise, the client would need to do that. I actually see defer in this case like the old batching approach that with the export directives, just with a nicer syntax, and there you would have the same effect. So.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like you probably don't even need to limit this with the validation rule, or the mental model that I've had. You can tell me if I'm underinformed. Was there's a equivalence between defer and stream and assembling independent queries. Assembling those independent queries could be like extremely annoying, and that's the value of this feature. But if you were to create those independent queries, they would just kind of like independently error at the top boundary. Or another way to think about this would be, you know, we're splitting these into separate incremental payloads in the stream. And now it's the client's responsibility to decide how they want to do that error bubbling behavior. So they know that a streamed list is not done until the request is completed. And if they get a stream payload that is errored with no data, right, the error has bubbled all the way to the top and cleared out the data, then that client will still need to have some appropriate behavior for like reifying the final list, right? Like it's got to take all these streamed payloads and turn it back into the final set. And it could decide, I'm okay with having a partial list, or it could decide, oh, I got a top level error, I'm gonna just blow up this entire streamed end result. Or it could do something more sophisticated, like where was that error in the stream, and I will sort of client side play out the GraphQL null propagating behavior. My sense is that, and probably why I see Joe's comment above, he's like, seems fine, is like if relay were to get any top level error anywhere, it would just throw the whole thing out and try again later. And so like maybe we're overthinking it. But
yeah, I would I would definitely lean towards stream, just like treating the same way as defer, like it's the client's responsibility. Like there are a lot of cases where people will want to stream where the list has a non-nullable inner element. And what they're doing by having a non-nullable inner element is providing a contract. They're like, this list will never be null. If they ever do get errors, like that's a major issue in their implementation that they have to fix up. And I don't think we should restrict good implementations from being able to use stream with non-nullable list items just because like it is undefined what the like client is supposed to do when a bad implementation ends up in this state.
We also just straight away can't do that because it would be a conflict. At the moment, taking a nullable field and making it non-nullable is a non-breaking change. But if that query were to have a stream directive on it, you can no longer safely change non-nullable fields to being, nullable fields to being non-nullable, because that could break previous queries that were previously valid. So we just can't add that validation, I don't think.
That's a good point.
Yep, you're totally right. What's Rob, I guess kick us back to the top of your doc. What's the sort of like stated current behavior and proposal?
Yeah, the current behavior is just that the null bubbles up as high as the data field for both defer and stream. I guess I was just concerned about a client that has generated types that says it can't ever have a null inside of this array, but then it does happen because of here, and if the client doesn't like explicitly know to do something about it, you have types that don't line up with the actual data.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that only only the client can handle that. And I like what Joseph said. It's essentially each of these payloads is there's a null boundary between these.
Yeah.
And
yeah, my thinking was just that putting the validation on there would just kind of kick the can down the road a little bit, but Benji's point about how that validation would cause that side effect, that's definitely a problem. So you guys think that it works to treat basically defer and stream as null boundaries, and that, yeah, so that's what I already have. So then I don't think there would even need to be changes, but we'll make note of it in the spec.
I guess my one other thought is, do we want to include, like, is there any missing information here about how to handle that error? Or I get, so like two subtle differences that could happen in this incremental payload. One is that we could decide whether or not to include the data field at all, which I believe is what we do. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that's what we do for just a typical response if an error bubbles all the way to the top. Or is that, no, that's the difference between an error before the data generation begins and an error happening during execution.
Correct. Yeah, it would be null if it happens during execution.
Yeah. Okay. So I stand corrected. This is the appropriate response in that case for the data field. But the other would be, do we want to have some kind of information about what to do with the error? Like if that path can have a null placed there or not, you know, like, is that a safe thing to do? Should we kind of leave it to the client to know enough about the schema to decide whether it can naively merge the value at data into the path there, or whether we want to have something that you know indicates that this is like that this error needs to propagate further, or like this is not safe to merge. You know what I mean? So I feel like the naive client that you would really love to be fully functional would just be anytime you get an incremental response in the stream of responses, you look at the path, you go into your data structure and you take the value at data and you stick it there. And then you just like repeat every time you get a new thing, accumulating a final result. And if there's ever a case where that is not the right thing to do, then we should make sure that we include explicitly in it a piece of information that makes that the case. Like you shouldn't need side knowledge in order to know whether that's a safe operation to do.
Would
you know what I mean?
Would you add an extra, like an error code, or to make this error special, or how do you think about that?
I think the client could still do that, but it also would have to generate, if it's generating types and it has stream on a non-null list field, it would have to change that to nullable.
Oh,
right.
Not necessarily changing it to nullable, but this is what I'm saying, right? Like if for this example that you've got up on screen, the async iterable non-null error field is returning you an array of non-nullable strings, but then the payload says, hey, the 1th index of that array is the value null. And a naive client would just do that. Like it would say like, all right, like my naive client doesn't know anything about the current schema. And to Benji's point, like nullability can change subtly in non-breaking ways that make this sometimes difficult to reason about. But ideally, you could build a naive client that doesn't need to have complete schema knowledge to do the right runtime behavior. And if it just takes the path and inserts the data at that path, what you've done is inserted a null there. And if someone downstream had like human read the documentation and read that, this is a list of non-nullable strings, like, great, I never need to worry about doing null checks. Then this could result in a null pointer error. So ideally you'd have some bit of data there such that your like minimal client that's capable of handling defer and stream could say, oh, I cannot naively merge this path. Maybe it's subtle, like killing the data field out of the payload to indicate that null is actually like not the appropriate value to provide here, because there's a difference between we loaded the data and it was fine and the value is null versus, hey, we tried to load this data and we couldn't do that. Actually, that speaks to a slightly different subtle piece here, which is for the top level response, the data field is always an object because the data field always corresponds to the query body, which is always an object. So if you get something that is not an object, you know it's wrong. But these incremental data payloads are not definitionally an object. They're whatever the field was that you happen to have deferred. So null could be easily misinterpreted as the real value as opposed to a caught value. Maybe we want some sentinel to differentiate between those two cases.
Maybe we could have the data field for stream payloads be a single element array in the normal case.
That, or my other thought was omit it. You know, if you fail to generate data because of an error, then you omit it from the payload.
Yeah, until now, omitting it means we never got to the point of execution. But I mean, it's anyway, we have a special case for subsequent payloads, because in subsequent payloads, as Lee already said, we are allowing scalars as data. So we could make a new rule for data, what it means if data is not there. Or we could, I mean, you could also, if we are talking about not very well implemented clients, maybe make it more explicit. I don't know.
Omitting it is kind of nice because then we could also do the same thing for defer, where a defer payload should always be an object, but it'd be a nice parallel that if it error it out because the null bubbles all the way up, that we just don't include it for both defer and stream.
Yeah, I think having this same behavior for both is going to make things much easier to understand.
What in the case of defer, what? Oh, if there's nothing, it'll end up just being, if there's like nothing in the deferred response, it'll just be an empty. Like, what do we do when like the connection closes? Or like if the server wanted to say, I can't actually deal with that, I'm closing or something like that. Like that's different. Like all the data you got was valid, but I can't finish up.
But
just
then you have
the last payload, right?
But you also send has next. You don't send. You send a has next. Yeah, in this case, you have the same.
Are you talking about like a subtly different problem here?
Right. I want it basically. There's the error of the data was wrong, in which case in normal response we'll have a null data field or data key, whereas the data, like I didn't even get to executing the data because the server like panicked or something underneath, and I just want to close this, give you a has next false.
It's not only that. It's also with async iterables. You wait on this stream, and maybe at some point the stream just says, "Okay, I'm finished," but you already sent you sent down a payload. Wait for the next, but then the stream says, "Okay, I'm actually finished," and then at the moment we send down a payload without data and say, "Okay, there's no more payload." And in this case, Matt, you're correct. We would have a conflict, but we could combine that with the errors. So if data is not there and error is there, but I mean, it's
So like the tricky bit is that the case Rob's describing here, we would probably want the naive client to basically be able to say like, "Whoa, this is as though it was an error from the start." And
I feel like what you're talking about goes beyond naive versus non-naive client. You're just talking about like non-normal response closing. Like what happens if you're the last response in the stream that has next true, and then the stream transport closes, like whether that's like whatever you're doing HTTP long polar, like whatever it is, like that thing just like, and you're done, like your stream is done. You're like, what does that mean? We should probably, like, obviously that's incorrect, but like we should have something in the spec text that describes like how that scenario should be interpreted, like that it no like normal operation should produce that result, but like what is the appropriate way to handle that? You should probably interpret it as if the final payload errored fatally. And the other is like, what happens if you say, hey, I actually do have next, and then through normal operation you realize like, oh, actually I did not have anything next. Like in the case of a defer, that should not be the case. Like you've got something that you deferred, of course there's going to be something to work on. In the case of a stream, you would just payload out an empty array.
We do allow we have in the spec, you're allowed to send a payload with just has next false and nothing else on it. And the primary case for that is an async iterable. You get the payloads. Once you have a payload, you don't know if another one's coming synchronously. So when that async interval is closed asynchronously, you send the has next false payload with no data on it to know that the whole connection is closed.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob.
Exactly.
That describes exactly the error case that I like. The fact that we're considering data being gone being like this error bubbled up is the I think that case exactly describes why that might be a little weird.
Right, except that in this case there'll be an errors array without data, right? But I do agree with here that it's a little weird.
Also, in this case, there will be a path and a label if a label is provided, whereas the other case would just be a has next false.
Yeah. I'm comfortable with that differentiation and like a client having to know that much sophistication.
I think just another angle toward always wrapping the data in a stream payload with an array is that if we want to go in the direction of maybe adding arguments to maybe stream payloads, like, I don't know, 2 at a time, 3 at a time, whatever at a time, that sort of gives us a jump on that.
So you would make data an array?
Yeah, I mean, so far we're just doing single payloads, but it would be a single array list, I guess, whatever. We have the option.
This all introduces new problems, because at the moment when we patch, you say on which item you patch it, but when you provide an array, where do you put these items? You would need for each item a path.
Right, so you need like a start path and an end path. Right now we have a path, and you'd need with an index, and right now you'd have as the last element of that path. And I guess, this is talking about in the future. I mean, I guess you'd need another the payload to say what the end path is if you have more than one element. I mean, really, it's just the list size. So I'm not sure if you actually do need that.
I'm glad you. Sorry, go ahead, Benji.
I think I might have been saying the same thing. I'm glad you brought this up myself as well, because I think often in these sort of back-end things, say you were pulling like thousands of records from a database table, it's quite common to batch them like 100 or 50 at a time. And at the moment, there's quite a lot of overhead because you have to put the wrapping payload around each of those individual entries, whereas being able to send all 50 and then the next 50 and then the next 50 more efficiently would be nice.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think of it for that reason, just to solve this problem, but yeah.
Yeah, Benji, you just said what I said. We should recognize that not all of the server-side streaming primitives operate the same. The fact that the async iterator operates on a unit by unit basis is the JavaScript and C# thing, but I know the hack language does batches of arrays. So you emulate async iterator by having batches of arrays of size 1, but you could have batches of arrays of any size, variable size, and that gives you the ability to do chunked streaming. And this actually has pretty real ramifications on GraphQL query execution performance, because if your backend is streaming you stuff like 3 or 4 units at a time, and then you are sort of artificially, just by the way that the payload process works, chopping those into one, and those each have like a depth to execute, right? You could be doing all of the depths of execution for the first one, then all the depth of execution for the second one, and you've turned a parallel data fetching problem into a serial data fetching problem. And that could be a pretty serious performance penalty. And that feeds into what's actually in front of us, which is what do you do with nulls? That would actually sidestep, Jakob, to your point earlier, then that makes a lot of sense. If you define that a stream, for a defer payload, the data field is always an object, and for a stream payload, the data field is always an array, then a null for either of those is very clearly no data rather than the value null for some particular path. And then it does mean that we need to differentiate something, maybe actually to the point about having a start path or an end path. I don't know if that's exactly the right shape, but maybe it's something different from path. Path is the appropriate way to frame this for defer. It's plainly obvious. This is the
but actually even the behavior here is different between these two, right? For a defer, you go to the path and you take the data object and you do a merge. You say this object is being merged at this path. And for stream, you're not doing a merge. Right now you're doing a set. You're saying for this particular path, this value is being set here. But actually, if it were an array, it would be a concat, I guess, unless you could stream out of order, which is that something that we're supporting right now, Rob?
No, that was the previous item where we said we don't. because the item before that, we said that we will, to make it easier for the clients, we will do it always in order.
Yeah, I think that's the right default behavior. I know there are some servers which support, like one is a literal linear stream and the other one is like a parallel stream where you say, I got 10 of these things and the order actually doesn't really matter. I just want you to send them to me in the order in which they're ready. And that's probably the wrong default behavior. Like the vast majority of lists that you'll find in GraphQL probably are ordered. And that might not even be something we want to support on day one, but having a payload that is flexible to support that behavior, should we ever want to get there. Like, for example, we could say path is the same. We just remove the last piece of the path, which shows you your index. And then that gives you a path to a list. And then the behavior is whatever the data field is, you concatenate it to the path. And if that data is null, then you know that that concatenation is not a safe operation to do. But that precludes the ability to use that same payload mechanism for a out of order stream if that's something that we might want to support ever in the future, which seems reasonable.
This, like having stream lists in the streamed response sounds actually very similar to ending up with like streamed connections. Like saying, I want a connection to be streamed. Like right now you would have it be sort of deferred, but you can't, like you'd have a stream of the list of the connection. Stream. Yeah.
Anyhow, seems like for this particular how to handle non-nullables for data, this actually seems really straightforward. If the behavior for a naive client is to take what is expected to be an object payload at data and merge it into the whatever you find at path, then merging a null should give you an indication that something has gone clearly wrong. And if we can repeat that behavior for stream in some way, then that's probably the right path for this specific one. But yeah, I think we got to make sure that we got one is batched payloads for stream. By the way, both of these could be things that we decide not to support on day one, batched streams and parallel streams, but having a payload mechanism that is resilient to support those in the future seems wise. That way we don't end up having to like create yet more response payload forms. That'll still allow us to stay lean and have a way to ship this with like a minimal set of features. And then we can say like, all right, batch streams and parallel streams bring their own set of quirks that we'd want to work through. But at least, you know, we kind of know the ramifications on the response form factor.
I think also, I mean, with the pass, I just reflected a bit on that because it still can point to a specific item. Because if it's an array, it's like an insert at this position, and then you still have the ordering that. We don't actually need an end pass. If we say, okay, we have a chunk of 3 items, insert them at position 2, then you start at position 2, insert them, and you have it ordered like the 7-10 minutes. Could work out good.
Sounds like we got some bike shedding to do on that one, because I think there's probably some alternatives to consider.
So do you think that just the entire thing of what we're doing now of the stream payload returning one field is not like we can't move forward with that because we need to support merging and later?
I think in terms of like what you're capable of supporting overall in the proposal, I think that's fine. Like the spirit of keeping this as minimally scoped as possible so that we can land on something that actually gets out to people, that's the right call. But making sure that whatever we do land would support like viable, like it would be a bummer if we come back to this and be like, all right, an immediate follow-up we want to do is, turns out this database yields its rows 5 at a time. And like, how do I get query efficiency there? We go, well, you can't, because our payload response form factor doesn't support that. Like that would be unfortunate. So giving us some flexibility to support that, I think would be good. And it's just a sort of coincidentally nice that both this non-nullable field problem and that problem feel like two views at the same problem. So that's giving me a sense that just our response form here needs to be like minorly iterated to be slightly more generalized, and hopefully that solves a bunch of issues.
But we are all in consensus that this should be an array in any case, the data for stream.
I don't know if there's consensus there. That's what I was saying. I think maybe we want to open a discussion thread about like what's the appropriate response, incremental response form for a stream payload that you could imagine how it would be extended to batch, how it could be extended to parallel, how it could be extended to managing bubbled up errors. I think I like that. So thanks, Jakob, for the suggestion. It's probably the right one, but yeah.
Can I just
not
ask,
something we have to decide live.
when you use the word Lee, parallel, are you referring to potentially out of order? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, we use the same list abstraction to model sets and lists, and the majority of them are lists. The ordering is important. For sets, you just model them as a list where you say like, yeah, if there's indexing here, you just like ignore it because it's a set. If you wanted to stream a list, everything we have here is exactly what you want. If you wanted to stream a set, all of a sudden this ordering thing feels like an unnecessary constraint. And that's not something that I'd like us to solve in this first run at the RFC, because we got to figure out like, all right, well, what's the appropriate argument you put in the directive? Is it a different directive? Like there's a whole design space there to go make sure we get right. But I think if you had a set of things and you didn't care about the order and you wanted them streamed, you're just like, I don't care which one you send me first, just like start sending them to me in whatever order they're ready. Then really what you want to do is, maybe under the hood, it's, you get an array of IDs and you got to go fetch them all from your database. And you tell your database, just like stream these ID rows to me as you have them available. And you don't worry about what particular sort order you give your database. Similarly, so for you got to prepare their subtrees. So you go do all the like field completion for each of those payloads. And then rather than saying, I got to wait for everything to complete for the first one before I can deliver that before the second one, you can just, whatever one's ready first, you just send. That would be clearly bad behavior for a list. I think that was the conclusion from the previous discussion. And since the majority of lists are in fact ordered lists, that is exactly the right behavior to at least have as a default, and probably the right behavior to just have period for like an initial change to the spec, but just like acknowledging the fact that people model sets as lists, and that might be something that they very reasonably want to see this behavior be able to expand to in the future.
Does having the path index in the payload, because the server could still be doing that behavior, whichever one is ready first, that's what it sends with whatever the next index is, right?
Yeah. My intuition, like I said, I don't want to have to make a decision here on exactly the right response shape. We should follow up. That way we can like write stuff out and like look at it. But my intuition is 2 small moves will fix this. One is Jakob's suggestion, which is the data field is an array. And then the second change is take the index out of the path and make it its own field. So there's just like a @index. And then that way data is an array, path is the path to an array. We describe, hey, for both deferred fields and for streamed fields, the behavior is always merge. And for an object, that's object merge. And for an array, that's concatenate. And the index information tells you where we expect that list's length to have been when you started that concatenation. And I need to like stare at it a bit and think about whether my idea actually makes sense to make sure that that works for parallel as well.
Do we actually need the index at all anymore? Because the server just can send you that in order, and you just concatenate that in order. And if the server doesn't want to send it in order because it doesn't matter, it sends it in any order. So actually, we don't need the index anymore.
The index has value for smart clients. Like if a client is merging this into a graph, the index does have value. It's basically like, what are we overwriting? Where do we start that overwriting? Because you could have queries coming in at the same time, updating the exact same path. So there's value even if naive clients would just like concat.
Yeah. And then also just to get parity with things like error message paths. Like if your error message path is misaligned to your data merged data, you can get in confusing states. But I see what you're saying. Like on day one, if we say these things definitely always come in the right order, then array concatenation just kind of gets you there, and you really don't need anything extra. My other thought is like in adding in this as a separate field is now you have a super clear delineator between what is a stream payload versus what is a defer payload. I guess you could also look at, hey, is the data field an array type versus an object type? But like, this is a good case where you might not be able to do that. If it comes back as a null, then you're like, ooh, shit. I guess I have to follow this path and see if that path leads me to an array or an object, but having some definitive piece of information that you go, all right, I know for sure that this was intended to be a streamed result, not a deferred fragment. Seems like a very useful like sanity check for a client to have to know whether it's about to do bad behavior or not.
I really like adding, say, an index.
Yeah.
That feels very clean.
But anyhow, we don't have to make a decision on that here. But yeah, that's my sense is probably what would work.
So I've got a couple of other thoughts. One is, I think that stream and defer themselves effectively imply nullability anyway. So I wrote an example into chat a little while ago, 20 minutes ago. If you've got three non-nullable fields, and you were to set one of them to be null in your response, that would blow up the fragment, which would mean that that would no longer get merged in. But your client, if it was a naive client and is expecting those fields A, B, and C to be present, is going to end up with them not being present. So though they're not necessarily nullable, they are optional. And I know we have issues between the difference of those two terms. But similarly, with a list, if you had a non-nullable list of non-nullable elements, and you were to throw an error for one of those elements for some reason, it wouldn't be right to just not add that item to the list, because then you'd feel like that list had a certain length that was different from the actual length. Like if it said there's actually 4 people, but one of them threw an error and now the list has length 3, that's potentially problematic as well. So I do wonder if, I mean, effectively, we do need to raise the fact that there were errors. We can't be too naive, otherwise client assumptions are going to be wrong.
That's why I like the described client behavior of, if you get an incremental payload and the data says null, that means that that incremental payload failed to generate. And the most naive behavior is to be like, I can't trust anything here then. So like whatever my client state was up until this moment, I'm gonna like throw it out and like retry or something like that. That's basically what Relay does today, is my understanding. And that would be fine. The more sophisticated behavior would be to do the crawl and say like, all right, if I were to escalate this error, is there something further up above that I could slice and in a reasonable state? For deferred fragments, this is a little bit easier because you can kind of mental model it as two parallel queries where one query succeeded and the second query failed. For streamed lists, what you described is very correct. Like if you definitely don't want to merge in a null, or like concatenate a null to an array, like that should kind of definitionally be an error state. And either you got to throw out that array, or you can leave it to the client to decide what to do. But it's at least obvious that that's like a non-viable operation to perform. But like you said something really important here, which is like the difference between nullable versus optional, which I think actually is very relevant here, because if field B says it's a non-nullable int, and you don't query field B, your payload is going to have A and C in it, and your client is going to be aware that that's a completely valid state. Like despite the fact that B can never be null, there's an important difference between B having the value null versus B not being requested. So if B is deferred, my thought is that is more like B not being requested than it is B being temporarily null. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's one of these things where if we were to have these fragment fields like what Matt suggested previously, what was the name of your new meta field, Matt?
Modularity.
So keyed fragments are like where
the one before that.
Before that, the is fulfilled or yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So the is fulfilled would be able to resolve this issue. Like it would still be non-nullable if that fragment was fulfilled. So there's definitely overlap there, I think.
Yeah. My hope is that clients do this rather than with a meta field with a different marker between the difference between the value null versus it not existing in the fragment in the first place, which they'll need to, for something that's deferred, we'll have to have sort of a similar parallel to. There's always going to be some intermediate state where that piece of data is not there yet. And it would be incorrect to say that that data is currently null. It would be more correct to say that that data is currently loading, or that data does not have a runtime value yet, which is different from that being null. So you need some sort of like left-right type or something like that to model that.
I got a question. What if we see it as a nullability boundary, so you can return the null? What's the server responsibility after that? So like if it's a null that would make a certain part of the response bubble up, if it wasn't a boundary, then is the server still allowed to respond with a non-null further thing that would have also been within that larger boundary? And is it allowed to respond with some of them but not others of them? Because like if what's going to happen to the client if you get it tracks it up, it decides this whole subset's null, and it did that extra tracking, not the most naive client, but then it gets something else that's in the part it already threw away. I'm not sure. I don't have any answers here. Like, is there a server responsibility?
Great question.
Once there's been an error, I think anything after that point is undefined.
I would support this notion as a server developer. As I'm listening, I'm kind of feel that we're putting too much on the server in general. When server error happens, the responsibility of the server return clear errors, error message, all information. That's the main responsibility. How much data it returns, make the best effort. If you return now in non-nullable field, it's okay, because again, this is an error and server is doing its best, right? So basically all bets are off and server just needs to do something, at least return the message, which we do, right? And then some data.
If we get one of these errors, should the server just, should that be the last payload and anything that was coming after should get canceled?
I feel like it shouldn't necessarily be the last payload, because if a client wants to do some nuanced error management behavior, like basically emulate the null bubbling error management behavior on the client, then it would be probably not the right thing to kill all other ongoing work on the server. For defer, this seems like, certainly if there's like child defers below something that failed, I don't know if that's even a possible scenario to end up in. Basically the same constraints that you talked about in the previous part of this discussion. Right? If you break one of those constraints, then you're doing the wrong thing. So for stream, if our constraint here is you can't by default or at all, the constraint is you can't send a later item in the list before you send a previous item in the list, and a previous item in the list was not delivered because of an error, then like that's it. Like that's the last one for that particular list. But if you had two things, like you had two streams, two lists being streamed at the same time, like that one of them, you shouldn't get the later one before the other, maintain your constraint. The other one might be able to continue to send payloads.
Exactly, yeah. I agree.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
For the case of fields ABC and field B, comes like field B is deferred and comes back later as null, then if you were to apply the bubbling up behavior client side, it's kind of like Schrodinger's null. It's like it's just you don't, until you see it, you don't know, and so then you're retrospectively like bubbling up and removing data you already had. And I wonder if it's worth specifying don't do that, and to say that this is an exception to bubbling up because defer kind of creates a boundary, and so when you get that first bit of data, if it as a whole follows the rules, then that's okay. Same as this, as if you'd done it in two queries, because otherwise just adding defer in there kind of changes the behavior, where let's say there is a null that you would see, but like that defer, you just never actually get that final bit that tells you about that null, then then you don't bubble up. And then if you do see it, then you do, but maybe you've already acted on the data. Does that make sense?
I think the idea should be if the request goes to completion, then the result that you will have on the client in a deferred world ought to be the same as what you would have if you didn't have that at defer at all. So in that case, like when you're in the intermediate state, things might be weird. Like you might, right, B is defer, like B is going to end up being null, which will kill the parent, but that's okay. Like it will kill the parent and the other stuff happening in the query keeps going. Like it should be fine for a client to kill the parent, even if it like previously set values below that parent.
It feels a little bit like as if they've effectively got like a skip directive on them, but you don't know whether it was passed a true or false, right? Like when you defer something, you may or may not get it, depending on if an error is thrown or not.
That's how I was thinking about it.
I think the question is, should we at all specify it here in the spec? or leave it to particular case and implementation, because there might be different, absolutely way different cases when all this happens. And sometimes the stream or the third thing is like stock ticker. Who cares if we skipped a few? Or a chat in a legal firm where it's a whole bunch of things. I mean, so basically what I'm saying is that, does it need to be the specific behavior? Can it be left to the implementers? And we just don't specify it.
That would be my preference. I think this is a case where you want non-normative notes to explain how to think about this and being aware of the potential for the error condition. But I agree with you. This like error behavior here is hard to define because you're starting to factor in like product requirements of how this API is going to get used. And, you know, we can't decide that on behalf of folks. I do think it's reasonable to have an opinion, and like, this is what we think reasonable behavior is like, should be in most cases, but you know, rather than that being a requirement, it being a suggestion and pointing people towards the thing that they should be thinking about is more important than actually speccing what a client needs to do. At the end of the day, the spec doesn't cover really what clients do with this stuff anyway. So well, this was certainly a fruitful discussion. I feel like we got through a bunch of sticky problems and have some interesting ideas. Rob, what else do you want from us at this point?
I guess what I'm mostly worried about is if changing the stream payload at this point is pretty big and might have a lot of additional input from a lot of people. So like, I don't know, in the interest of moving forward with things, does it make sense to separate out stream and move forward with defer, or for just to not blocking one by the other? Or
yes,
it might. I don't think that's crazy. I think you could keep them rolling in parallel, and especially if you get to a state where defer, everyone has really high confidence that defer is in its final form and we should ship it, and stream still has some open questions, then we can do that. I don't know that you necessarily need to kind of decide that now. I think it's actually been quite helpful to be thinking about them simultaneously, because a lot of the runtime mechanisms are similar. In the cases where they're different, it's quite interesting where they're different, and it has design ramifications for both of them. But yeah, I agree with you. Like, I don't want to end, if we're in a state where stream has open questions and defer feels bulletproof, then we should at that point have a conversation about untangling defer from this so that we can ship it and then come back to stream. My interpretation though is that actually we're like working through the last bit of these open problems, and it's not surprising that as we do that, we are coming to like minor tweaks and changes. And I understand that even when it feels minor, it has like a ripple effect across everything else. But yeah, let's make sure that we don't block defer from work ongoing with stream, but also that we don't limit ourselves for doing the right thing for stream just because we've gotten as far as we've gotten so far.
yeah, definitely. I bring it up a lot because it does seem like a lot more people are looking to use deferred than stream, and stream seems like it has a lot more. There's been like a lot more feedback on that. But this case with the non-nulls also, it seems like they should be handled together. So so the next steps for this, I think that I should start a discussion about changing the stream payload to an array and separating index to another field, right? And see if there's any more feedback on that, just with the thought that it would allow more flexibility for batching results in the future.
Yeah, and I think like the design bike shedding is probably going to be the easiest part of that. Actually the tough part is what you just said. Like what's the ramifications of this on all of the other decisions we've made so far and the implementation? Like is all this reasonable to roll out, or is there some other like pretty significant thing that we're not seeing as to why this could be like super difficult to do?
Yeah, I think the biggest the biggest ramification is that it would unblock this non-null thing potentially, with allowing us to return data null unambiguously, right?
Yeah. I mean that fixes this, but I mean if we were to change this response payload from a value to an array, change the path to mean something subtly different, like are there other things in built implementation so far, or other parts of the spec surface area that all of a sudden get way more confusing? Like we're looking at this in a really narrow lens through this specific problem, but you have a lot more context than the whole surface area of where these things touch. If we're not seeing something about how a change like that could have negative implications, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I have to think through that because I haven't thought of that possibility yet.
Totally. It would be crazy if we just figured it out live. Yeah. Anything else?
Just reading the chat real quick.
Sorry, I thought I heard some consensus before, but I'm not sure if there really was about whether it sounds like I'm being told that there wasn't. And I guess we could continue discussion on that the same issue that we're looking at, as stream as an error boundary. Is that
I think we're like directionally aligned, but there's nuance into like exactly what we mean by stream ending and like which stream. And so just like getting it written down, just making sure that we're all looking at the same thing when we say these things, I think is important. My sense is, I don't know, I'm hearing like mostly agreement about the remaining open problems and what we want to do about them, and not like a lot of back and forth with like different proposals. So I'm feeling really optimistic that we'll kind of burn through this stuff pretty quickly as soon as we get to like a shared understanding of what we're talking about, which we just need to write it down.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like to me as well. So great.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rob. That was certainly more than 20 minutes, but that's okay because we had the time and that was a super productive conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll write that up and then hopefully we'll have something for the next meeting.
Fantastic. Who put this last agenda item up? I don't have a name. Recursive references and fragments.
Hello.
Oh, that's you, Roman.
Yes.
Floor is yours.
Okay, so I hope everybody had the time to read the proposal as an issue. So it's basically, I see it as a really minor thing and quite logical thing to do. And essentially, I'm not proposing to add something to the spec, but rather remove some unreasonable restriction, which seems like out of place, and for never use recursive or fragments that form a loop. So I bring up the benefits. I show that even the graphical query, the graphical introspection query contains rather strange, multi-step looking like a letter fragment to retrieve, unwrap the type of the field. And this can be essentially this information can be retrieved with a simple recursive fragment. So I will try to share. Do you see my screen?
We do.
I'm new to Zoom, so I might be not very efficient. But basically, this is the typeref fragment that GraphQL uses to retrieve the information and makes assumption of maximum complexity of the type of the wrap type. And it doesn't look pretty anyway. And instead, that's the typeref rec standard for recursive. That's the equivalent fragment if we allow recursion. And another case, for example, the cases for this are all around the place. We use the recursive fragments to unfold the chains of data references. Another one is, for example, the chain. Sorry, okay. But probably those who work with Microsoft Outlook, there is a page where you can see, look up somebody, and you can see the chain of responsibility of managers of an employee going up to the CEO. And it can be like 10 people long in corporation like Microsoft. But now the question, if we imagine this is done, the data connection is done through GraphQL, what would be the fragment to retrieve the entire chain? And it's the same challenge as with the unwrapping type. So you can use simple recursive fragment, or you can explicitly specify to certain depth. Basically, the spec says that the fragments should never form loops because they result in infinite recursion. While it's not true, as you see, the fragment can be recursive if the self-reference is inside the selection subset of some of the fields. You can still hit the infinite loop if the data itself is looped. And that's potential trouble. But what I argue is that in any case, the server implementation, the framework that implements the GraphQL, it should have multiple circuit breakers against abuse or errors in the queries. So basically, I don't see it's a big deal to add additional counter of the fragment depth.
The reservation I would have with that is, at the moment, like the above query is not nice, but the client has essentially full control of how deep the client wants the data to be. And if you have a recursive fragment like that, you offload that responsibility or that control from the client to the server, and the server now decides how deep you will get data back. And that's now at the moment it's more explicit. So it's from the front end developer or from the consumer defined how deep the server shall go.
And now I understand that's concern. But what about the client who says, I don't care? I know it's limited, like if I want to show the chain of managers, of my managers, and basically it's in the client and server, usually from the same kind of team. The client is, the client app is downloaded from the server, right? So basically I know that this is the limited chain of responsibility, probably no more than 20. And I don't want to build this multi-step fragment. I just want to bring them all. So this is kind of counter examples, the convenience for clients. And reasonably, they would expect in most cases, this would be an limited chain, right?
Yeah, this is not the first time that we've talked about this, although I think it's been quite some time since the last. So I was trying to find the references to the previous discussions. I couldn't find it. So it's probably in the early days of the working group. But it was very intentional that this limitation was added. Part of one of my favorite anecdotes, which is one of the members of the original GraphQL team, was always upset that we called it GraphQL and felt that it should have been called TreeQL, because we really talk about modeling and returning trees, not graphs. And we talked about this recursion problem, really motivated by exactly the example that you put up here for introspection of, introspection is in fact a graph, and you really want to be able to query it as a graph, but we have limitations in our response form. Response is always a tree. So I think 3 major concerns have limited us from addressing this in the past. One is 2 variants of a security problem. The first of which is just infinite recursion, which, to your point, there's ways to put limitations in, but that limitation would not be a pure removal of something, right? We need to specify what is the behavior when something is an infinite recursion. How should it halt and when? The second one is an overlap between a security issue versus a data quality issue, which is entering the same value multiple times and ending up with multiple iterations of that in the payload. There's other examples where this happens, but recursion is a way to generate that. So you can imagine something is cyclic. Ideally, you would like to identify that it is cyclic right away and immediately halt at the point that you find that it is cyclic. Some servers do not have the ability to do that for various reasons, and they may sort of like loop through, a dozen times before they finally decide, hey, I've been going pretty deep. Something's probably going wrong here. I'm going to stop. And I don't remember what my third one was. The third one was evaluating just like what is the cost of not having this, and is it high enough that it warrants addressing all these kind of easy to get wrong security and data quality ramifications. And that one in the past, not to say that past decisions always have to hold in the future, but that decision in the past was, no, it is not. Like it is always easy to use a combination of a fragment and a significantly nested type to model exactly the behavior that you wanted to have gotten from that recursive fragment. So for example, the example that you put up here for the recursive return types for a field, in practice, it's a little bit different in that there's a fragment that describes all the fields that you want to get there, and then there's a separate fragment that describes that recursively. And it literally just looks like of type spread a fragment, of type spread a fragment, of type spread a fragment, and you can just read how many levels deep that is. If it's 6 or 7 or 8, you can just count them. And that is essentially the desugared version of what we would do if we had a fragment recursion. So, I think the cost of screwing this up is really high. It's part of the reason why we haven't addressed this in the past. You can imagine a poorly built client failing to handle these security issues and creating a DDoS vector for themselves. And so we'd have to be very, very careful to make sure that certainly our reference implementations didn't suffer such a fate, but also we were very crisp about what it would mean to have a recursive fragment. I think the last time we talked about this, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was Joe Savona and I that were investigating this. The path that we were going down before we ultimately decided to cut it loose and not do it was, if a fragment was recursive, we would have a validation rule that asserted that it had a directive on it that told you the maximum depth. So you had to specify a depth. And we started looking at this and looking at all the validation code that we were writing, and we're like, this is a lot. There's only like a small handful of use cases where we actually want to do this in practice. We'll just manually unwind them. And that's kind of what killed it in its tracks last time. But anyhow, I wanted to make sure I added that context in.
Okay, thanks. I wish you edited this to the my original post. And although I do agree with all this, and it turns out if you already discussed this.
Long time ago. So it's always good to bring these back up.
Yeah, but the thing is, what really strikes, the same arguments apply to any programming language or programming system regarding recursion. The dangers, and however, all of them go okay, and they probably, everybody knows the dangers of recursion, right? If you are really stupid and directly call yourself. I actually seen some case, try catch handle error, try catch, and inside the catch handle error call, recursion inside the catch. It was a real case and real application, and they were wondering why the services hang and die completely. But what I'm saying is that so while it has definitely some sense, all these arguments, why we're so different from other languages, which actually all these things are equally apply to any other system.
What other APIs support recursion like this?
Languages, I mean, C#, Java, any language.
GraphQL is not a language like C#.
Yeah, this is actually really important for static analysis, like essentially the halting problem, right? Like you really want to be able to, given a query, and there's whole tooling chains out there that do this. And, part of the thing that I think we should hold close is to make sure that we're enabling those tooling chains that try to look at a query and give a prediction of that query's complexity, like roughly how many units of data might it consume in max, can it become a DDoS vector? And that's already a relatively tricky problem, but a manageable one. But as soon as you start adding in programming language-esque features, you make it considerably harder because you run into the halting problem. And you essentially, you just have to run the query to know how long it's going to take, which is probably not where we want to be from a query safety point of view.
Yeah, I mean, there is past precedent of so Bazel, for instance, Google's compilation language is basically a subset of Python that is guaranteed to halt. And it's very strange what has to be done, and it's hard, right? It's from a language design perspective, you have to be very, very crisp on what a loop means and what inputs are allowed into a loop and things like that, which, yeah, is it possible that we could have some amount of auto unwrapping or things? Yes, but the amount of crispness required is really, really high.
But I think this is more like counterexample or example in my favor that you bring that. Static analysis is very limited thing, and trying to do it perfect statically is probably hopeless, right?
But we do, currently GraphQL does. And part of that is that GraphQL's goal is different from a generic programming language, right? The goal of GraphQL is not to enable arbitrary program creation.
Yeah, there's always going to be limitations to static analysis, and I don't know that it's fair to say that we do it perfectly. There are things that we can do statically that we know we have complete knowledge of because of the nature of the language. There's others that we don't, like query analysis is a good example, or complexity analysis rather. There's just inherent limitation, because you just don't know. Under the hood, there is, complete arbitrary execution that's going on. So, but I think rather than viewing it as a binary of things we want to preserve or not preserve, we should view these as trade-offs. And for a data query language, especially one that's publicly exposed, the nice thing about a programming language is that you probably are vetting all the code that's running. You hire or pay the people, or you code review the code, or there's some mechanism to control what code gets executed. Oftentimes for GraphQL or any API surface, it's not always the case. You're going to take arbitrary input, and you need to be able to do some analysis to know that it is safe to execute. And that's an important thing. But that's not to say that there's like hard lines about what we can and can't do. It's just a consideration that we need to weigh against the other things that we want to do. As that applies to fragment recursion, I don't think it's damning for fragment recursion. I think it's just a consideration. Like the conclusion that Joe Savona and I had come to last time we addressed this was we should just view this as a desugaring step, right? Like you should be able to take a query with a recursive fragment and convert it into one that has no recursive recursion, and use the max depth to do that. But then as we got to that, we're like, we looked at that and said, how frequently do we expect this to be encountered, and how painful is it to manually do that desugaring yourself, and how complicated is it to implement this desugaring? And that net, we realized like this wasn't the most important thing for us to do at that moment in time. But our conclusion wasn't that this was not a useful problem to solve. We saw it as an important problem to solve. And it may be the fact that new things have come to light in the many years since we last talked about that, where this is a more useful thing to do. I think if I was going to give some feedback and some direction for next steps into doing this, would be kind of fleshing out, rather than this being purely a removal, what are the other things that we would need to add to ensure the same level of safety that we have today to the spec. And then the second is a more real motivation of the problem. I think you've done a good job of highlighting the abstract cases and the specific case for introspection, but generally for a typical developer, how frequently do they encounter this? Beyond the example use cases of an organizational chart, like do people write organizational chart APIs all the time and we're missing something? Is this a common request from the community? Or is this something that people come across every once in a while and kind of are grumpy that they have to do something that feels like it could be written more reasonably if they had recursive fragments? Or is this like a regular pain point in API design? That makes sense?
Yeah. But I want to add one just simple note. Again, I'm a server-side developer, and I feel like in the spec in general speaks too much about server-side execution rather than leaving to server implementation take care of things. And like the goal, I feel like the goal should be expressing in the most simple, concise way what the client wants to be delivered, not how. And I think allowing recursion, and the less restrictions, the better. Basically, how to do this and what kind of troubles the server will run into, it's up to the server. Like N+1 problem, it's hidden inside and nothing we can do. And it's about efficient server implementation and taking care of this, right? So I feel like the spec at least should stay kind of away from the troubles that potentially server can have. Yes, there might be loops, but we will take care of this as a server developer, I can say. So the benefit is less restrictions and be more like other languages. By the way, the example of the query language that allows loops is SQL. In SQL, you can have common table expressions which reference themselves, and that's the way
true.
of unfolding these kind of loops or references, right?
That's true, but you don't typically expose SQL that supports recursive loops over the internet for arbitrary consumers to issue queries.
If you ask for examples, yes. So here is the example. So it's not that unusual. But okay, I understand all this reasoning. So that's it. I'm shutting up.
Yeah. To be clear, I'm not saying that this is not a thing that we should do. I just want to provide the appropriate context to make sure that as we move forward, that we do so in a way that factors in past and current concerns. And your framing of the intent of the spec, I think that's super fair and very aligned with how this group has thought about it thus far. The spec needs to describe to a client what to expect as a result given their query. And sometimes they need a mental model for what the server is going to do. But there's actually a line pretty high up in the spec that says, as long as the server has equivalent behavior, it's happy to implement these as in whatever form they do, as long as it produces a result that would be visibly equivalent to the steps described by the spec. For the case of recursion, you'd want some mechanism to describe, am I going to get 2 levels deep, 10 levels deep? Like as a client, what are the boundaries of the things I should be able to expect? And if you were to implement the same thing in multiple services, like what is the allowed variance and what is the constraint? You want to be able to specify those things so that clients know what to expect and how to interpret their payloads. But beyond that, then I completely agree with you. It's really important to allow a lot of flexibility to the server. That's an important part of how servers evolve.
Okay, thank you.
We have 10 minutes left. Do we want to use them to quickly go through the open discussions that you have, Alex?
Oh, yeah, sure, we can do that.
Just to give people a sense of what you've opened up since last month, and then probably not enough time to go deep in them, but that's okay.
Yep. Yeah, here, let me share my screen again. Cool. Yeah, so like I said, it's split into 3 things. There's yeah, let's see, there's 4 options for list syntax. There's not a ton to say here. I've linked previous discussions for each of these. I'm still not sure what we do to like, to move forward with this discussion really, but I'm looking forward to hearing what more people have to say. And then on the null propagation side, there's 3 options right now, and if I've missed any, please let me know and I'll add them. But there's 3 options. There's the one that shoot, it was Joe and Jordan. No, yeah, just Jordan introduced. It was the last thing that he introduced in the other thread where nulls propagate from exclamation points to question marks. There's non-destructive exclamation points where no change is made to the data, and then there's the status quo where it's treated as non-nullable and it propagates with the current non-nullable rules. I've added examples for each of these.
Alex, your option 1 there talks about the status quo with the non-nullability with the exclamation point, but it doesn't mention the question mark.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So basically, I think people like in our discussions, people were attributing a pretty wide variety of behavior to the question mark. In terms of what it does, I think that marking things non-nullable and marking things and error catching are 2 pretty distinct things. So I'm hoping we can talk about them separately. And then if we decide that we want behavior, the behavior that we can mark things nullable, and we want the behavior that errors can be caught, then we can discuss if the question mark should do both of those, or if those should be 2 different pieces of syntax or something like that. So I'm trying to hold these discussions sort of in stages. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I was just thinking that from a one way of presenting one of these combinations, right, is that exclamation point makes something non-nullable and question mark does the opposite, and that is the only change. Like it's a very straightforward thing to think about then. And it feels like that should be presented as a cohesive option where they both work together in that way. It feels like that is option one, except option one doesn't actually specify the behavior of the question mark. Do you have, was there a different discussion that was talking specifically about the question marks?
No, I haven't. I don't think I've specifically mentioned the question mark, except for in this option. I don't think I've mentioned the question mark.
Mm-hmm.
But I can add something. Yeah, I'll figure something out.
I know we effectively get combinatorics here, like here are the behaviors for exclamation point and here are all the behaviors for question mark. But I do think that the one where it just changes the nullability and does nothing else, just pretends that that was what it always was in the schema, is a cohesive option that should be analyzed.
Sure, yeah, I'll find a place to introduce that one, for sure. And then, yeah, so I have those three here. And then, second, Zoom is covering up my tabs. I can't get to my tabs. There we go. And then the third discussion is error handling. And we have no error handling. We have errors caused by client control nullability are treated as distinct from all existing errors. And then query syntax is introduced to catch errors. And this is sort of what people have been talking about as an option for question marks so far. I use different syntax to try to not confuse things, although I don't know, maybe that confuses things more. We can talk about it. But each of these also has a bunch of sub options that we would then discuss if one of these options is chosen. But a lot of these are sort of like implementation details. You know, how do we achieve the thing that we're trying to achieve?
Matt, maybe you can help us poke Joe to get some attention on these, since a lot of his bold feedback led to the creation of these as fervent grounds to make sure that we were iterating to the right spot.
Yeah, I can do that.
Oh yeah, also Matt, there was an error handling option that I think you introduced at one of these discussions, and then I don't remember if you still wanted it to happen, but where a field marked with like a catch syntax could be either the piece of data or an error. Are you still interested in that? I haven't added that in here.
That is super interesting, but I think I was like stating this as it would be really great to have somehow built into the type system. I think that as a solution would be like very nifty and clean from like a design perspective if we were like doing a clean room solution, but also probably is like very out there on how it works right now. So I wouldn't necessarily like support that as the path to getting errors on nullability like resolved.
Gotcha. So are you okay if it's not up for discussion, or do you want it to be part of the discussion?
I think it's probably fine to leave it out. I don't personally think that would make sense. If Joe brings it back up and is like, oh, this would be the perfect way to do it, but I don't think he will. I think
gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's the impression I got of what was happening. Cool. And then Roman, I think had a suggestion. He left me some early feedback, so I gotta edit some stuff. But that's what's here so far. I want to try to direct discussion away from the main spec thread and into these discussion threads. I think it'll be easier to follow and easier for people to digest. They can, write huge walls of text in favor of some, their favorite option without, clogging up discussion for everything. So they should feel free to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for getting these open. I think this is already, I know only a couple of people have weighed in so far, but it's already way easier to follow along with what's going on. So thanks for doing that. And this poll thing is cool. I had no idea that was something you could do. That's super nice. And it's helping us spot where there's already like firm consensus. I think your like list syntax is getting pretty dang close to consensus there, and versus where there's like active discussion. So this is cool. I really like this path.
Yeah, I think it's definitely helpful. Something I want to point out though, in case people feel uncomfy about this, you can vote multiple times in these polls, and you can vote for multiple options. So if people are like, voting security in our GraphQL polls, that's fine. We can talk about that. But yeah, I mentioned that these are non-binding. It's just to get a sense of sentiment.
Awesome.
Can I just Ellen?
Go ahead.
Can I just ask about the add catch directive? That piqued my interest, seeing as I've dealt with errors as unions in the schema previously, and this seems like an interesting way to be able to add that to an existing schema. You were, and I'm saying you, Matt, you were saying that it was not something you would pursue in the context of this nullability discussion, right? I would love to. Okay. Yeah, was there anything written up previously, or was this discussed in the working group? I'll need to dig it up then.
I put it in here as a directive just because that's like a piece of syntax people will be familiar with. But it could be anything. Yeah, it's just kind of arbitrary syntax.
Sorry, yeah, I was zooming in on my phone, but I see it now. Okay, cool. Thanks. I'll spill along from there.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you for the overview of these. Take this as license, everyone, to jump in and weigh in. Hopefully this moves these forward between now and the next meeting. Thanks, Alex, for continuing to focus on them. Much appreciated.
And then I saw Ivan put up some stuff for Canary releases, which I think helps move forward our experimental flags on the implementation. So that was the other update we had.
I love that. That's great. All right, folks, that's time. Love when we have a small number of agenda items, we get to go deep into each of them. So really useful discussion. Thanks everyone for your participation, and I'll see you all next month.
Thanks everyone. Goodbye.